A black hotel maid once answered a call in Dutch in front of Millionaire, and the very next day that moment changed her life forever. Zoe's cell phone had rung as she scrubbed the marble floor of the luxurious lobby of the Grand Plaza Hotel. Normally, she would never have dared to answer during work hours, since rule number one from Manager Richards, especially for the cleaning staff, was no phones. But she recognized the number and her heart stopped. It was a university calling after 6 failed attempts at securing a scholarship for her master's program in linguistics. This could be the call that would change everything. Whispering to herself to stay calm, she hid behind an ornate column and answered discreetly, "Zoe Johnson," hoping the passing guests would not notice. On the other end spoke Professor Van Ton from the University of Amsterdam in perfect Dutch, and Zoe responded fluently, her pronunciation flawless, as they discussed the details of her application. She nervously explained that her motivation letter might not have been received on time when she suddenly noticed silence around her and looked up to see Richard Coleman, the billionaire hotel owner, watching her with open surprise, while beside him manager Richards glared with fury. Zoe's throat tightened, and she hung up quickly, but the manager's voice cut through the air, commanding her into the office. The long walk to the basement administrative room felt like a march of shame as colleagues stared, some pitying and others satisfied. At 29, she was the only black woman in the cleaning department with a college degree, a fact manager Richards never acknowledged. The rules were thrown at her again. No phones during work hours, especially not in common areas. And when Zoe corrected that she had been speaking Dutch, not French, the reply was cold and merciless. "I don't care if it was Martian." What mattered was that Mr. Coleman had seen a cleaning lady ignoring her duties. The injustice burned because Zoe knew white receptionists took calls freely without consequence, yet she was sentenced to months of punishment shifts cleaning convention center bathrooms after exhausting corporate events. That night in her small shared apartment, she cried silently in front of her framed linguistics degree and international certificates, reminders of 6 years wasted cleaning hotel rooms, while her dream of master's degree and an academic career drifted further away. The next morning she arrived early, determined to show professionalism despite her humiliation, but soon the front desk called her name, summoning her to human resources. The HR offices were on the top floor, a forbidden world for staff like her. She felt invisible in the elevator filled with executives discussing million-dollar mergers, as if she were not there. When the HR director asked her to sit, she braced for termination. Yet instead came an unexpected order. "Mr. Coleman has requested a meeting with you." The billionaire's office was larger than her entire apartment, and when she entered, he looked directly at her and asked in a blunt tone, Dutch, French, Italian, and Mandarin, correct. He had her resume before him, and revealed that he had requested it immediately after hearing her the previous day. Honors degree in linguistics from Georgetown, fluent in 6 languages, 2 of them Asian, and cleaning my hotel for 6 years. He recited with disbelief. Zoe could hardly breathe, for she realized this was not a coincidence. Behind that phone call in Dutch was a chain of events that would soon expose not only her own hidden brilliance, but also the ugly system of discrimination that had kept talents like hers buried behind brooms and cleaning carts for years. This was the moment her life and the balance of justice in that place would begin to shift forever. Sign up to discover how a single phone call in a foreign language became the spark for a turnaround that not even the most powerful billionaire could have foreseen. For a few seconds, the office was wrapped in silence as Zoe stood frozen, trying to process the words she had just heard. Richard Coleman was looking at her not as the invisible cleaning lady ignored in the corridors, but as someone whose identity he now truly recognized. 6 years, Coleman repeated slowly, closing the file and folding his arms before asking why a Georgetown-educated linguist had been scrubbing his bathrooms instead of working on international translations. Zoe inhaled deeply before answering that she had submitted 47 resumes to the International Relations Department of the hotel, all of which were ignored, and had attempted 12 internal transfers, all denied by Manager Richards and Director of Operations Mr. Whitmore. Coleman wrote their names down without hesitation, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharpening as he recalled how Whitmore had repeatedly complained of a shortage of multilingual staff, especially for Asian conferences. What Coleman did not reveal was that 3 months earlier he had discreetly hired a consulting firm to investigate the unusually high turnover among non-white employees in his East Coast hotels, and the results had been deeply troubling. "Zoe," he said bluntly, "tomorrow, We are hosting a trade conference with Dutch and Chinese business leaders, and I need someone fluent in both languages who also understands cultural nuance. And you wanted to clean their room, Zoe asked with a trace of bitter sarcasm. Coleman allowed himself a thin smile before replying that he wanted her to serve as international relations coordinator for the event, effective immediately at a salary of $5,000 a week. Zoe nearly dropped her purse. As the figure struck her, it was more than she made in 3 months. Why me, she asked. There must be hundreds of qualified applicants. Because I heard you speaking Dutch like a native, because your qualifications fit what I need, and because I suspect something very wrong is happening inside my company, Coleman answered firmly. An hour later, Zoe entered the elevator with a new badge granting her full access to hotel systems. On her way to HR to finalize paperwork, she encountered manager Richards, whose face drained of color at the sight of her. "Johnson, what are you doing on this floor?" Without a uniform, Richards demanded. "International Relations Coordinator," at the direct request of Mr. Coleman, Zoe replied evenly. The woman paled further, muttering that Zoe did not have the qualifications, but Zoe calmly interrupted, reciting Georgetown linguistics degree fluent in 6 languages, including Mandarin and Dutch. "My resume has been in hotel files for 6 years, along with 12 ignored transfer requests." She left Richard stammering in the hallway and proceeded to HR, where she met an unexpected ally. Zoe Williams, a newly hired recruitment analyst, greeted her warmly, explaining that she had noticed Zoe's file when she joined 3 months earlier and had never understood why someone with her credentials was stuck in housekeeping. She confided that when she tried to raise the issue with Whitmore, he shut her down immediately. Later that afternoon, as Zoe prepared materials for the upcoming conference in the VIP suite, she discovered something alarming. The official event documents contained poor and, in some cases, offensive Mandarin translations that could have triggered serious diplomatic embarrassment with the Chinese executives. She carefully corrected the errors and redesigned the welcome packets when Coleman appeared in the doorway, silently watching. "How did you know those translations were wrong?" he asked. Zoe straightened and replied with quiet confidence that the phrasing used was culturally inappropriate and in formal corporate Chinese could be considered an insult. Zoe explained that whoever had produced a translation clearly knew the basics of Mandarin, but lacked the cultural depth required for a high-level diplomacy. Coleman listened intently, and when he remarked that Whitmore had assured him the best translators had been hired at great expense, Zoe calmly corrected him, showing him a glaring mistake in a partnership proposal, and adding that whoever was hired had not even been vetted for credentials. The next day, the grand conference began, and Zoe moved among the Dutch and Chinese executives with quiet authority and poise, seamlessly switching languages and guiding discussions with such ease that agreements, which usually took days to draft, were being shaped within hours. Her ability to bridge cultural gaps and anticipate nuances left seasoned negotiators quietly astonished. During a break, Whitmore finally approached her, a man who for 6 years had treated her as invisible. His smile was polished, but his eyes betrayed unease as he said, "Miss Johnson, I must admit I am impressed. It seems Richards gravely misjudged your potential." Zoe inclined her head politely, but answered with subtle precision. "It is also impressive how my resume, which clearly listed fluency in Mandarin, was consistently overlooked, especially when the hotel paid $50,000 for inadequate translation services for this very conference." Whitmore's smile stiffened, a crack appearing in his polished demeanor. He tried to deflect by murmuring that there must have been a misunderstanding, but Zoe cut him off with calm certainty. "I received confirmation of every email I sent over the past 6 years," she said evenly, including the ones in which I highlighted dangerous errors in contracted translations for Asian events. What Zoe left unspoken was that her new ally in HR had given her access to the translation contract files, and there the truth lay bare. The translation firm paid a fortune by the hotel belonged to Whitmore's niece, a woman with no formal expertise in Mandarin, who charged expert rates and consistently produced flawed work. Those errors were not minor. They were patterns that could cost the company millions in lost business and credibility. That on the 3rd day of the conference, the unexpected occurred. One of the Dutch executives paused mid-conversation and looked closely at Zoe with growing recognition. "Wait," he exclaimed with genuine surprise. "Are you not the student who authored that brilliant article on linguistic variation in international business that was published in the Journal of Applied?" Richards, now pale, stared at Zoe as if seeing her for the first time. No longer the woman in a uniform mopping floors, but the figure standing on stage beside the billionaire who commanded the empire. Coleman's voice carried with the authority of final judgment as he declared that nepotism and discrimination would no longer be tolerated in his hotels, and that every file, every promotion, and every rejected application over the past 5 years would be reviewed by independent auditors. The audience shifted uneasily as the evidence on the screen left no room for denial. Charts revealed the pattern in damning clarity. Qualified non-white applicants rejected, while contracts worth hundreds of thousands had been funneled into the pockets of relatives and friends of managers. For Zoe, the moment was surreal. The same executives who had brushed past her in elevators without acknowledgement were now staring at her with a mixture of shame, admiration, and fear. Some of the Dutch and Chinese delegates whispered among themselves before one stood and applauded, soon joined by others until the room filled with reluctant but steady clapping. Zoe bowed her head slightly, steadying herself as Coleman gestured toward her and said this woman prevented a crisis that could have cost us not only millions, but also our international credibility. Whitmore, stripped of composure, stood rigid at the side of the stage, his face drained of color. When security stepped forward at Coleman's order to escort him out, his last glare toward Zoe was filled with venom, but it only underscored his downfall. Richard sat frozen, trembling as the realization set in that her fate was no longer in her own hands. Coleman concluded the assembly with a vow that the Grand Plaza would undergo not just an internal reform, but a transformation in how it valued human capital. Talent would never again be buried under prejudice, and no employee, regardless of background, would be denied opportunity. He turned to Zoe and said clearly enough for the entire hall to hear, "You will continue as International Relations Coordinator, and I expect to see you rise even further." For Zoe it was vindication, but also the beginning of something greater. She knew the story was not just about her. It was about every overlooked worker whose brilliance had been hidden by systemic bias. As the executives filed out of the auditorium whispering about resignations and restructuring, Zoe stood taller than she ever had before, knowing that a single phone call in Dutch had not only altered her destiny, but had shattered the walls that kept countless others trapped behind brooms and cleaning carts. The question now was not whether she belonged in those halls of power, but how far her voice and her fight for justice would carry. Thomas Whitmore, once the untouchable director of operations, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of the industry. His name had become synonymous with nepotism and corruption, a reminder of how quickly power could collapse when built on prejudice and deceit. Zoe continued her presentation with unwavering confidence, her voice resonating across the conference room as she outlined the next phase of the Invisible Talents program. This initiative would ensure that no skill remained buried under discrimination, no career suffocated by the bias of those in authority. She explained how the mentoring system would create a chain of opportunity, where every employee who rose to the ranks would commit to lifting another. Coleman leaned forward, his expression one of genuine respect, as he said quietly, "This is no longer just about hotels, Zoe. This is about rewriting corporate culture." The board members, some reluctant at first, now nodded in agreement as the undeniable results glowed on the screens behind her. Numbers that showed not only justice but profit, not only fairness but growth. For the first time in the company's history, morality and business success were walking hand in hand. Far from Manhattan, word of Zoe's rise spread like wildfire through the industry. Young employees in hotels across the nation began whispering her name with hope, realizing that if she could rise from the housekeeping department to the executive suite, then perhaps their own dreams were not impossible. In online forums and union meetings, her story was told and retold, not as a fairy tale, but as a revolution quietly reshaping the standards and empire. As the meeting concluded, Zoe stood by the tall glass windows of the 32nd floor. The skyline of New York stretched before her like a canvas of possibility. 6 years of invisibility,